it is my pleasure to introduce is Najee Olya, who is a PhD candidate in the program for Mediterranean Art and Archaeology at the University of Virginia. He earned a double BA in Anthropology and Classical Civilization from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and an MA in Classics from the University of Arizona. Najee's research focus is the art and archaeology of archaic and classical Greece, with specific emphasis on pottery produced in the city of Athens. He's interested in such issues as identity, otherness, race, and how interactions between ancient Greeks and the non-Greek peoples of North Africa, the Near East, and the Italian peninsula influenced Athenian material and visual culture. Najee's dissertation, tentatively titled Constructing the African in Ancient Greek Vase Paintings, Images, Meanings, and Contexts, is an exploration of visual representations of African individuals that appear on the painted ceramics produced in Athens from the 6th through the 4th centuries BCE, and the social cultural milieu in which the creation of the vases was made possible. In the field, Najee has participated in excavations of Etruscan Populonia at Poggio del Molino in Italy, and since 2018, he has been part of the archaeology lab team at Mount Lycaon in Arcadia, Greece. Najee has also won numerous fellowships and awards in support of his doctoral research from the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. He was awarded a Hill Scholarship in 2017, the Bert Hodge Hill Fellowship from 2019 to 2020, and he is currently a William Sanders Scarborough Fellow this year. Najee is also the recipient of a Lewis and Clark Fund for the Exploration and Field Research Grant 2018 to 2019 from the American Philosophical Society. And for 2022 to 2023, Najee will be the Bothmer Fellow at the Department of Greek and Roman Art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And now he will be giving a paper titled On the Invisibility of Ethiopians, Interrogating the Presentation of Greek Images of Black Africans in Museums and Their Absence in Greek Art Survey Textbooks. So I'll hand things over to you now, Najee.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Hannah. I'll go ahead and share my screen. A major defining feature of ancient Greek art of the archaic and classical periods is its interests in the representation of self and other. Beginning in the 6th century BCE, ancient Greek artists began to depict a range of foreign others, both mythological and real. These include Trojans, Amazons, Persians, Scythians, Thracians, and Africans. Imagery involving the last of these groups, in Greek vase painting in particular, is the focus of my doctoral research and central to the present talk, which considers the racialized visibility of these and other objects in museum collections and their invisibility, that is, near absence, in survey books on ancient Greek art and archaeology. First, to offer some context, it is worth briefly discussing depictions of Black Africans, or Ethiopians, as the ancient Greeks called people from the south of Egypt, in general terms, as ancient Greek artists portrayed them in different media across several centuries. The earliest instances appear on ancient Greek vases. The kinds of vessels decorated with renderings of Ethiopians appear on a range of shapes, such as those made for perfumed oil or the consumption and storing of wine, like the alabastron and cantharos shown here. In the 4th century BCE, during the Hellenistic period, representations began to appear in other media, including sculpture. In the depictions on this slide, the artists have portrayed a young jockey on horseback and a young singer or performer. Even so, since Greek vase painting is the single largest body of extant visual evidence from ancient Greece, it provides many of the examples in this talk. I I want to begin our tour of museum collections in Princeton with a janiform cantharos, or drinking cup. Artifacts of this kind, called plastic vases for their three-dimensionality, appear in a variety of forms. Full Ethiopian figures, single Ethiopian faces, and janiform pairings of Ethiopian and other faces. Artifacts of this sort provide some of the best-known depictions of Africans in ancient Greek art, and the striking imagery has resulted in the objects frequently appearing on flyers for lectures and presentations dealing with race in the ancient Mediterranean. Indeed, this is the framing employed in the Princeton Art Museum's description of the vase. Mentioned here are racial stereotypes, theories of racial difference, and a display of slaves. There are a few problems with this. First, the explanation does not acknowledge in any way the important differences between the modern phenomenon of race and difference and otherness in ancient Greece. The distinction between ancient and modern thinking is obscured, and an interested visitor to the museum's website would have no way of knowing this. Second, without recognizing these important distinctions, the result is that people of African descent are uncritically presented as eternal slaves, in antiquity as in the modern era, what the classicist Sarah Durbo has criticized as the trope that, quote, black equals slave in perpetuity. Within the last decade, some scholars, including Susan Rotroff, William Thalman, and Kelly Renhaven, have pointed out the ambiguous nature of the artifacts and the difficulty in determining whether or not the renderings of Ethiopians should be understood as enslaved figures. In three separate discussions, they each highlight the difficulty in determining what the images are meant to represent. And while each of them raises the possibility that these are indeed images of enslaved people, a definitive determination cannot be made. What is important in such discussions is the recognition that ancient Greek slavery did not rely solely on the enslavement of people from Africa. This is not to say that slavery in ancient Greece was any more humane than the modern iteration, made possible by the transatlantic slave trade, simply that it was different and that the particularities of each should be clearly articulated. Other issues of terminology can be seen in the description of another plastic vase in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Here, two female faces are paired to form the cantharos. There are several interesting things happening in the text on the MFA website. First, the two juxtaposed faces are referred to as black and white, using modern racial categories, which would have meant nothing in ancient Greece. This is reinforced by the explicit conflation of white and Greek. Then the other face is referred to again not as black, but African. Once more, nuanced explanation is missing, and the reader is left with the impression that modern racial categories are somehow applicable to antiquity. Another striking example in the same collection is a vase depicting the binding of the mythological Ethiopian princess Andromeda in preparation for her sacrifice to appease the Ketos sea monster, which had been sent to ravage the coasts of Ethiopia. Poseidon had sent the sea serpent as punishment for the boasts of Andromeda's mother Cassiopeia, who dared to claim that she was more beautiful than the Nereids. The description of the figures painted on the vase combines race essentialist terminology and the analysis of Andromeda and her father Cepheus's appearance, along with the uncritical use of the term slave to describe the Ethiopians who appear in the scene. Given the preponderance of ancient Greek artifacts of this sort which depict Ethiopians in museum collections, it is unsurprising that there are some current ongoing efforts to revamp the approach to describing this material. At the J. Paul Getty Museum, for example, the curators and researchers are in the process of critically examining how Ethiopians have been written about and the ways in which labels and other texts can eschew outdated terminology while also aiming for greater clarity. This is especially important since museums are one of the primary interfaces between scholars and the wider public. Likewise, the North Carolina Museum of Art has developed a major initiative to reinstall and relabel artifacts in its ancient collection, including Greek vases. One example is a vase with a depiction of Memnon, the mythological king of Ethiopia, and one of his Ethiopian warriors preparing to depart for Troy, accompanied by two horsemen. I was asked to write the updated label for this object, the text of which appears here. Creating an artifact description for a museum label is, I can now attest, a difficult task. One must take into consideration the need for accuracy, legibility for a public audience, and the practical constraints inherent to creating a text with a 100-word limit. While I have spent the first portion of this talk pointing out the need to rethink approaches to describing artifacts, I recognize that this is easier said than done. So at this point, now that I have discussed the racialized visibility of just a few depictions of Ethiopians in Greek vase painting at museums, I want to spend the remainder of my time focusing on the relative invisibility of the artifacts that portray Ethiopians across a range of media and time periods in Greek art and archaeology surveys, which are often assigned as textbooks. The idea for this exercise was prompted by an observation of Patrice Rankin's in an essay on one of the volumes of Martin Bernal's Black Athena. Rankin references the work of the pioneering Black classicist and diplomat Frank M. Snowden Jr., who spent his career researching both literary and visual representations of Ethiopians in ancient Greek and Roman art. As Rankin correctly remarks, however, the artifacts that Snowden was able to bring together in his books and essays, thanks to his affiliation with the US State Department, almost never appear in Greek art and archaeology surveys. Consequently, although there are a handful of journal articles and papers and edited volumes by other scholars on Greek depictions of Ethiopians, were it not for Snowden, most of the objects would have received nearly no attention. A look at Snowden's publications will underscore just how glaring the omission is. Across 2 books and a major essay, there are hundreds of objects in a variety of media: vase painting, sculpture, mosaic, coins, and more. The range is so wide that it would make sense for at least a handful of the artifacts to make their way into each of the larger surveys of ancient Greek art and archaeology. After examining a variety of the books for myself, however, it is clear that Rankin was not only correct when he first pointed out the dearth of Ethiopians in surveys over 10 years ago, but that he is still correct now. I looked at a total of 7 books, most of these first published or updated within the last decade, and carefully explored them to see if any artifacts that represent Ethiopians are discussed, and being generous if there are at least significant mentions of interaction between Greece and Africa more broadly. The authors are all well-known and prominent scholars in Greek art and archaeology. The texts are, in chronological order, beginning with initial publication, John Boardman's Greek Art, Susan Woodford's Introduction to Greek Art, John Pedley's Greek Art and Archaeology, Robin Osborne's Archaic and Classical Greek Art, Richard Neer's Art and Archaeology of the Greek World, Judith Berenger's The Art and Archaeology of Ancient Greece, and Mark Stansberry O'Donnell's History of Greek Art. I have limited the initial investigation to books in English, but at some point, I would like to do the same for Greek art survey texts in other languages, standard and classics, including French, German, and Italian, to determine if the same issue exists outside of Anglophone scholarship. Confirming Rankin's point was fairly easy, since across the 7 survey books, artifacts included that depict Ethiopians are few. The book that was first published and which is currently in its 5th edition, John Boardman's Greek Art, has the most representations, a grand total of 3. Boardman has always been interested in the interconnections between Greece and the wider Mediterranean, so this should not come as a surprise despite the early initial publication date of the book. Boardman's Greek Art concerns itself with artifacts from the geometric through Hellenistic periods, as well as the legacy of ancient Greek art. The 3 relevant objects included are 2 red figure vases from the classical period and a Hellenistic bronze statuette, shown here. The first artifact is a raiton, or drinking horn, formed in the shape of an Ethiopian being attacked by a crocodile. The second shows Heracles fighting the mythological Egyptian pharaoh Osiris and his priests, who in appearance are Ethiopians. And the third is generally thought to be a depiction of a young singer or performer. Beyond these objects, Boardman also discusses the influence of the arts of Egypt on those of ancient Greece. Unfortunately, Boardman's engagement with Ethiopians has generally not been followed in the books published after his Greek art. Susan Woodford's introduction to Greek art focuses on Greek vase painting and sculpture in particular, and chronologically covers the geometric period through the 4th century BCE. While Woodford does discuss the connections between Egyptian and archaic Greek sculpture, when it comes to Ethiopians, none of the many extant artifacts are included. Given that only 2 media are represented in the book, and that these are the ones in which a large number of the images of Ethiopians appear, their absence is especially striking. John Pedley's Greek Art and Archaeology is perhaps one of the most popular survey books, and like Boardman's Greek Art, is currently in its 5th edition. It is among the more careful and reserved of the books, offering a straightforward chronological discussion that begins in the Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE, and concludes with the end of the Hellenistic period. Pedley does discuss connections between Egyptian and Greek art in the Archaic period, and includes 2 objects that are tangentially related to Ethiopians. First is the well-known Arkeselos cup from Laconian vase painting, which shows one of the Greek Batiad rulers of Cyrene in Libya overseeing a scene of weighing. The composition is noted for its real-world subject matter and the influence of Egyptian iconography. The second object is an Athenian vase by Euphronius, which is decorated with the wrestling match between the hero Heracles and the Libyan earth giant Antaios, who is depicted in a manner similar to renderings of Libyans in Egyptian iconography. The single artifact that Pedley includes that we might call an image of a person of some Ethiopian descent is the Artemisian jockey, a large-scale bronze equestrian sculpture with a youthful rider. Scholars such as Sean Hemingway at the Metropolitan Museum have argued that the boy is depicted as a person of partial African ancestry. There are traces of the original patination on the skin, which are of a darker shade than typically found on bronzes, while the hairstyle is Greek. Despite including the sculpture, Pedley, adhering to a cautious approach, does not mention any of this. Things are not markedly different in the later books. Take, for example, Robin Osborne's Archaic and Classical Greek Art, which is arranged chronologically and again covers geometric through Hellenistic periods, but also attempts to embrace a more thematic approach to art. Osborne elaborates on the relationship between Egyptian and archaic Greek art, and the Arkeselos cup appears once again. The only directly relevant object included, however, is a black figure Athenian amphora by the swing painter, which shows the Heracles and Osiris myth set in Egypt. The swing painter has depicted the hair of the Egyptians with numerous tiny dots to visualize a highly curled texture, indicating that the figures are meant to be Ethiopians' appearance. The 3 most recent books are broad surveys, which, like Pedley's Greek Art and Archaeology, cover the chronology from the Bronze Age to the Hellenistic period. Of these, only Richard Neer's Art and Archaeology of the Greek World includes any of the ancient representations of Ethiopians. Neer does not highlight any of the material from historic Greece, however, but instead chooses a well-known example from Minoan Crete, the so-called Captain of the Blacks fresco, named by Sir Arthur Evans and excavated at the palace at Knossos. The fresco shows what appear to be Ethiopian soldiers led by a Cretan. Neer states in the book's introduction that he has attempted to take a broad approach to Greek art, and as a result, he includes several case studies outside of the mainland and islands. One of these is Cyrene in Libya, and so the Arkeselos cup is again included. Given the framing of the book, and Nir's expertise as a vase painting specialist, it is curious that no other relevant artifacts appear. There is not much to say about the final two books, Judith Behringer's Art and Archaeology of Ancient Greece and Mark Stansbury O'Donnell's History of Greek Art. While both of these, like the other texts, discuss the importance of Egyptian influence on archaic Greek art, neither author includes any of the artifacts portraying Ethiopians. The only related object that appears is the Heracles and Antiochus vase by Euphronius, which is in Stansbury O'Donnell's book. The absence of Ethiopians in the two surveys is especially interesting since these have the most recent initial publication dates. To give account now for all 7 books, there are only 6 artifacts which represent Ethiopians. So, what is to be done about the dual racialized visibility of Ethiopians in museums and their relative invisibility in ancient Greek art survey books? First, I want to make it clear that my goal in the preceding exercise has not been to attack or accuse. I have already mentioned the difficulty involved in the creation of museum labels and descriptions, and I am also certain that the task of creating survey texts is an incredibly complicated process involving the unenviable task of excluding materials that the authors, given unlimited space, might have included. That said, I would like to return to Patrice Rankin's observation from a decade ago, as I think that he has touched upon the crux of the problem. Now that classics as a discipline has for the past several years begun to reflect in a serious way on its fraught history, it seems poised to begin making tangible changes. For that to happen, however, there must be an interrogation of why questions of color and ethnic diversity in ancient Greece have not been asked, and what it has to do with who is asking questions about Greek antiquity in the first place. My talk today has been only a preliminary attempt, and although there are other scholars tackling similar issues, there remains much more to be done. I want to end then with the words of Frank M. Stoughton Jr., since Rankin rightly noted that he was, for many decades, one of the few people asking questions about color and ethnic diversity in antiquity. Although certain aspects of Snowden's own approach should now be eschewed, he was right when he declared that we need a fresh look at modern interpretations of the ancient evidence. This is certainly the case for the presentation of images of Ethiopians in museums. What I would like to add to Snowden's insight is that the next step is to make sure that his extensive gallery finally makes its way into the pages of Greek art surveys. Thank you.